In order for muscles to contract, we have to have energy available. The only energy the cell can use is the energy that's in the high energy bond of an ATP molecule. Muscles store a little bit of ATP, but that ATP is used up in a couple of seconds of muscle contraction. So we have to have ways to generate more ATP so the muscle can continue contracting. And there are three ways we can generate ATP. We can use direct phosphorylation of an ADP molecule. We can use aerobic respiration, or we can use anaerobic glycolysis and form lactic acid. Direct phosphorylation occurs because there is a molecule stored in muscle cells called creatine phosphate. Now, just like the phosphate that's added to ADP to make ATP has a high energy bond, the phosphate on this creatine phosphate has a high energy bond. We only find this substance in muscle cells, and it is considered a high energy molecule, but the cell can't break it down and use that energy. Instead, we have to break it down, stick the phosphate on an ADP to make ATP, and then the cell can use this energy. This is the fastest method to make ATP, but the creatine phosphate supplies are easily exhausted. They only last for about 15 seconds. The second way the muscle can generate ATP is using anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic means without oxygen. Now, muscles have a good blood supply and should always have plenty of oxygen delivered to them. But if muscles start contracting very suddenly, the capillaries may get closed off and blood supply to the muscle may be limited for a short period of time. Glycolysis is the process that breaks down a glucose molecule into a pyruvic acid molecule. Glucose is our primary fuel molecule. If oxygen is present, pyruvic acid will go on into the aerobic respiration pathway and we'll get a lot of ATP, about 36. We'll talk more about this process later. But if oxygen is not present, the pyruvic acid enters the anaerobic pathway, and the only energy we get is 2 ATP molecules, not very much. This process will only fuel about 1 minute of contraction. Pyruvic acid, when it enters the anaerobic pathway, becomes lactic acid. Lactic acid, if it stays in your muscles, is responsible for sore muscles. However, if it's cleared from your muscles, it can go to your liver and be turned back into pyruvate, and we can run it back through the aerobic respiratory system. Anaerobic glycolysis is very fast because there are very few chemical reactions involved in this, but we don't get very much ATP out of our glucose molecule. Aerobic respiration will get 95% of the ATP out of a glucose molecule. This is the process we use during moderate muscle activity. Aerobic respiration takes place in the mitochondria, so muscle cells have more mitochondria than many other cells. It also requires oxygen. This takes the glucose and breaks it down to water and carbon dioxide. It also makes about 36 ATP from breaking the bonds in the glucose, but because there are so many reactions involved here, it's a slower process. However, the amount of ATP we get allows the muscles to contract for a long period of time. So here are three methods for making ATP in the muscle cell. Direct phosphorylation, we have this high energy creatine phosphate stored here. We can't use the energy in this bond, but we can make ATP, and that gives us about 15 seconds worth of energy. Anaerobic glycolysis, glycogen can be broken down to glucose. If oxygen is not present, pyruvic acid becomes lactic acid, and we get a couple of ATP. This is maybe a minute's worth of contraction. The real big bang for our buck is glucose going into the aerobic pathway in the mitochondria, where we get 36 ATP. Takes longer to get this ATP, but we have a lot of ATP that we can use for muscle contraction. Muscle fatigue occurs when the muscle is unable to contract, even if it is stimulated by the nervous system. This results from an inability of the muscle to make more ATP. Primarily, this is dependent on blood supply to the muscle, which brings both the nutrients and the oxygen required for ATP production. As lactic acid accumulates, the pH changes. Also, this lactic acid staying in the muscle is what contributes to muscle soreness the next day. While we say that ATP is essential for muscle contraction, you seldom totally run out of ATP in your cells. Muscle fatigue is largely psychological. You've just worked a long time and you feel tired. The lactic acid and the change in pH may actually contribute to this. There are different types of muscle contractions. In all contractions, we see tension developing in the muscles. That is, they get tighter feeling. Isotonic contractions occur when the myofilaments are capable of sliding and the muscle actually gets shorter. This means that something actually moves. In an isometric contraction, the myofilaments try to slide, but they're unable to slide. The muscle doesn't shorten, but it gets tenser. There's no movement. This is like pushing against a wall. So an isotonic contraction would be like lifting your book. You'll feel the muscle shorten, you'll feel it bulge. And an isometric contraction is literally when you try to push against a wall. If you feel your muscles, you'll feel that they're tighter, but they don't bulge as a result of this. Muscle tone is not something you consciously control. At any given time, some fibers in your muscles are always contracting. This gives a little bit of tenseness to your muscles, that's the tone. It also makes your muscles ready to go anytime you need them. Muscle tone is important in helping with posture and in keeping muscles ready to react. Exercise will change muscle size and muscle mass and strength. Aerobic or endurance exercises give you stronger, more flexible muscles. It increases the blood supply to the muscles, and the muscle cells form more mitochondria. With a better blood supply and more mitochondria, these muscles will rely more strongly on that aerobic respiratory pathway, the one that gives you so much ATP, so you will be able to exercise longer. Resistance or isometric exercises is when muscles push against immovable objects, or it's like weightlifting. You don't lift anything very far. This will increase the muscle size and the strength of the muscles. The muscle size is because of an enlargement of muscle cells, not more muscle cells in the muscle. What happens is more myofilaments fill up the muscle. That makes the muscle cell bigger. Also, connective tissue increases to give the muscle more support. For skeletal muscles, which are going to produce movement, we have to have the muscles attached to bones. Muscles are always going to cross a joint so that they can make that joint move. The origin of a muscle is the attachment to the bone that is not going to move, the one that's going to stay stationary. The insertion is the attachment to the bone that's going to move when that muscle shortens or contracts. We have several different kinds of body movements. Flexion is when we decrease the angle between two places. Extension is when we increase the angle of a joint. And hyperextension is when we move beyond anatomical position. We increase the angle of the joint to more than 180 degrees. Rotation is when we rotate or move around a pivot point. Abduction is movement away from the midline. If you abduct someone, you take them away. So abduction is taking away from the midline. Adduction is when the limb moves closer to the midline. You're adding back to the body. If a joint can go circumduction, you can draw a circle with the end of that bone. Dorsiflexion is when you lift your foot toward your shin. That is, you're kind of walking on your heels. And plantar flexion is depressing the foot or pointing your toes. The hands and feet have some special movements. Supination is when you rotate so that your palms are face up. If you pronate, you rotate your forearms so the palms face down. Movements usually require two or more muscles. Prime movers are the muscle that have the major responsibility for causing the movement. Antagonists are muscles that oppose or reverse a movement. Now, obviously, we need antagonists if we're going to move extension back into flexion, but we also need antagonists to help us control the primary mover. Synergists aid the primary mover somehow. Some of them help produce the movement, others sort of stabilize joints so that there's not any undesirable movements. Many synergists are fixators. They stabilize the origin bone or hold that bone still or put tension on the insertion.